the fact that something is a masculine or feminine noun, unless it's an actual masculine or feminine item, like a person or a dog or something, has no relationship. There's no implicit like male nouns are better nouns or female nouns are worse nouns or soft nouns or hard nouns.
Yeah.
It's pretty much random as far as we can see.
Okay. Yeah, the difference between an egg and a piece of bread.
Exactly. And why? Well,
What about like a dog, a female dog? Would that be different
yes, then
than
that
the
would be
male
different.
dog?
Yes.
But if you don't know, you just do dog.
If you don't know, you default to the male
Okay.
because that's just simply the default. And likewise, if you're not sure about a plural, we default to the masculine form of the plural.
That's what
But
I
that doesn't mean
noticed.
you're making a claim about the gender of the thing that you are talking about. So like, for example, very famously in Jewish prayer, we often refer to avot or avotenu, which could mean our fathers, meaning our literal parent, father parent, or it could mean our forefathers in the English translation of old-timey English, or it could just mean our ancestors without any statement about gender at all.
Okay.
But unfortunately, a lot of people feel that it is inextricably linked with a gendered understanding. But that's an issue with people, not an issue with the language.
Thank you, Rabbi. That helps a lot. Now I got to add to my notes.
Almost ready. Just
okay, I got to get some salt.
Ready. In case anyone on YouTube has a comment. Okay, just about ready. I mean, I'm ready, but we'll give it another minute or two. I don't want to wait too long to start because unfortunately tonight's topic is a little long. It's not unfortunate that we're going to study a bit longer. It's unfortunate that this particular topic happens to be a longer topic. So this is, we're going to be looking tonight at the issue of anti-Semitism. This follows on a little bit from our discussion of the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 and the drive for building a Jewish homeland that began in the 19th century. And hello, Tommy, see you in the YouTube chat. But the issue of how Jews are viewed by non-Jews has been a very long issue. The technical term that is usually used is anti-Semitism, although that term is only a couple hundred years old now, maybe actually a bit less than that if I do my math. It's supposed to be derived from the word Semite, meaning a person who comes from the particular area of the world where Jews are from, meaning the Near East, the Semitic people who speak Semitic languages. Of course, it's a little bit inaccurate because, of course, there are many different types of Semites, not only Jews. But we have not come up with a universally accepted alternative. Sometimes you'll see people who come up with the idea of anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism. Sometimes you'll see people who come up with things like anti-Zionism, which we'll talk about when we reach near the end. But for now, we're just going to use the term anti-Semitism because it is the most widely used term. And most people understand that when we're talking about this, we're not talking about people that are just against Semites, but specifically about people who have something against Jews. And when we talk about people who have things against Jews, oh, hi, John, see you in the YouTube chat. When we talk about people who have things against Jews, there are many different ways that this gets expressed, many different types of anti-Semitism. There's cultural anti-Semitism, there's theological anti-Semitism having to do with the religion itself, and then there is, more recently, racial anti-Semitism. And then we'll also talk about those that treat their criticism of Israel in such a way that they are not merely opposed to some of Israel's policies, but that they seem to be venturing into a full-on hatred that is disproportionate to the topic that they are discussing. We will discuss each of these in turn. So let's begin with cultural anti-Semitism. This is actually what would probably be ranked the earliest form of anti-Semitism. That is to say, the oldest form of anti-Semitism. It attacks Judaism, meaning the culture that we have as Jews, as a way of life. And it claims that it is inferior or that it is actually corrosive, and its adherents, that's us, suffer because of it, as do the surrounding communities. They often will claim that it is lazy. The Greco-Roman communities were especially upset that we would waste one day out of every week with no work, what we call Shabbat. They consider that to be just absolutely lazy. They also complain that our religion and culture as an extension is legalistic and argumentative. Jews, as we've talked about and will continue to discuss, often will debate, discuss, and continue to have conversations long after other communities would have brought down the hammer and forced everyone to swear one particular form. And of course, our culture has been attacked because we have often been a minority culture. And most times, in most places, in most of history, minority cultures are often mocked and attacked by the majority culture. We are the perennial little guy, and that means that the big guys, even if they're not big by other measures, can almost always feel safe in picking on us. And these attacks have been around since even before the Common Era, right? Even before the year zero. We can go back to ancient Egypt, well, classic Egypt, during the Hellenistic period, when Manetho, who was an Egyptian priest and historian, using the term historian loosely here, he wrote that the Hebrews were expelled from Egypt, that we didn't have the exodus, that God took us out against Egyptian will, but that instead the Egyptians drove us out because we were all lepers, something that was considered to be an incredibly shameful insult in that time of the world. And that we were especially despicable because our leader Moses taught us not to adore the gods. As an Egyptian priest, he was a little upset that we did not believe in Egyptian gods. It's a shame for him, but no one really believes in them to this day. During the Roman period, there was also cultural anti-Semitism. The Romans were often writing things against us. However, this was not just because we were unhappy with Hellenistic culture, that we didn't adopt the Roman way of life, but we also were a political pain. We continued to reject Roman rule. We continued to try and break free. We continued to have uprisings, rebellions, and full-on wars. And that got a little annoying to Rome. And they would crush us, unfortunately, and then create magnificent new sculptures and architectural pieces, as well as new coins to commemorate our defeat in war. And they did so in a way that you would consider disproportionate. If you can imagine, it would be something like after World War II, America commemorating the defeat of Italy, as opposed to commemorating the defeat of Germany or Japan. Italy was definitely not a major power in the war and did not get the share of our exultation, our excitement over defeating that as an enemy. But the Romans did think of us as being especially obnoxious, and therefore they wanted to commemorate our defeat. Once again, who's still here? During the Enlightenment, jumping forward 1,500 years, cultural anti-Semitism takes on a new point. This is something we talked about a little bit during our discussion of the birth of Zionism, as people in Europe were struggling to understand how or if Jews could fit in. And taken from Johann David Michaels in 1782, he says, "Does the law of Moses make citizens and the full integration of the Jew into the other peoples difficult or impossible?" Notice he doesn't say easy, right? The two options are it can't be done Or it could be done, but it'll be really hard. Could Jews really be regular people in our society? I think it does, meaning it's either difficult or impossible. The purpose of this law, meaning Torah, is to maintain the Jews as a people almost completely separate from other peoples. Now, when he means the word separate here, he doesn't just mean that we maintain our cultural identity and allows us to remain Jews even when we are in a larger society that is not. What he means is that we will never fit in. We will never be able to be friends. We will never be able to be like-minded citizens that will wish for the best of our neighbors. He says instead, we will always be separate. And this purpose is an integral part of all the laws, down to those concerning kosher and non-kosher food. Anti-Semites really do get annoyed that we will not eat their bacon, with the result that the Jews have lived as a separate group during 1,700 years of dispersion. Now, you might think that's a compliment. A group that is able to have the determination and the loyalty to their beliefs to go 1,700 years despite dispersion. That might be the kind of group that, if you can make them also loyal to your own country, would be good citizens to have. And in fact, Jews have shown that they are remarkably loyal to every country that they inhabit. But for cultural anti-Semites, the fact that we can be loyal to our faith, in their mind, means we cannot be loyal to their country. Notice again, it is their country, and they are choosing whether or not to let us have rights within it. This was the fundamental problem that we talked about that led to the issue of Zionism in our discussion of the beginning of the Zionist movement a few sessions ago. One of our allies, and yes, this next statement comes from an ally, Christian Wilhelm van Boom, puts it a little bit differently. But impartiality, he argues, would demand that if a Jewish and a Christian applicant showed equal capability, two people show up and apply for a job, that if there's one Jew and one Christian, the latter deserves preference, right? You should hire the Christian, right? That's discriminating against the Jew in favor of the Christian just makes sense. And remember, this is an ally of Jews in his generation. This seems to be an obvious right of the majority in the nation, right? It's their country, so they should get first pick, at least until the Jew, by wiser treatment, are changed into entirely equal citizens and all differences polished off. So even somebody who believes that we can be part of a good European nation and that we could take our place among the ranks of its citizenry believes that the only way that can truly happen is if we stop being Jewish, right? Sure, we'll wear a Star of David necklace rather than a cross, but in every other way, there should be no way to tell a difference between a Jew and a non-Jew in his opinion. That is the ultimate goal, to help us. As he says, for all these reasons and trusting that human nature is the same in all people, I am convinced that in a few generations, the Jews will be just like all other citizens in those states, which will give them equal rights. Again, he is trying to compliment us by calling us human. He is trying to give us equal rights in his mind, but he is doing so based off the assumption that our equality will eventually be reflective of the fact that we have imitated them to the point where we cannot be distinguished. That our entry into European society is contingent, is based around whether or not we are willing to give up anything that is uniquely Jewish in our life. Any questions on these parts right now? In Europe in particular, there was also a notion that took hold about Jews being greedy. This idea that we are greedy or that we are crooked in business, this dates way back into the Middle Ages of Christian Europe. During that time period, Jews often had better trade connections, which is true. We had better international trade and even national from one country of Europe to another, because Jews in different countries cooperated. If a Jew showed up in another country, he could talk to the local Jewish community, find out what the bargains were, and most importantly, establish bonds of trust. Unfortunately, during the Middle Ages, European countries and citizens from those countries did not trust one another very easily, even if they shared the same religion. Jews did, and therefore it gave us an advantage. Not an unfair advantage, but simply an advantage built out of having trust. Over time, Jews were denied many jobs. We couldn't own land in many places, we couldn't join guilds, we couldn't work for the church, obviously, and many other forms of regular employment were denied to us. So as Europeans catch up in their own business dealings, as their business connections get better, and of course, by giving preferences to themselves and discriminating against us, our businesses suffer, we are now left without being able to find other ways of making a living for many of our people, except for using the money we already have to make more money. The way you make money with money is by loaning the money out and then by charging interest when it's returned. This was one of the few jobs that we were left with that could actually earn us a living. The nobility, the dukes, the lords, the earls, the kings, they were very happy to do this because they could force us to give them loans. You can't really say no to the king or the lord or the duke. And then if they decided their debt to us was too great and we were not useful enough in the short term, they would expel us, canceling the debt and thereby relieving themselves of that burden and relieving us of that wealth. Calling us greedy and making the other citizenry also angry that we even had loans which they came for and needed. This was a good way to excuse this behavior. This is reprinted most famously, of course, in The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare's very famous play, which contains the very anti-Semitic character of Shylock. Jews were often, however, hated for our poverty, as most Jews were actually kept poor in most countries in Europe during this time. It was only a few that were able to establish themselves as successful moneylenders that had these types of assets. Most Jews simply were not able to be very successful. And if you go back and you read the anti-Semitic attacks that were written during the Middle Ages and the Ages of Enlightenment, so-called, many of them are attacking the Jew not for being rich and greedy, but for being poor and dirty, because we had very poor jobs, like being a tinker or being a scrap dealer, bone collector, things like that. Let's move into theology, the different ideas about religion itself, not the culture of our people, but our religion in and of itself. Now, in the ancient world, of course, lots of non-Jews didn't like our religion because our religion didn't like their religion. I can't really fault them for that. When we say that the Egyptian gods are fake, when we say the Greek gods are fake, I don't expect them to like us for that, and I don't expect them to respect our religion when we say that either. The fact is, Judaism does believe that idols are not right, and we believe that idols in general degrade human life. However, idolatry has not been the main form of religion in the countries in which we have lived for most of the last 2,000 years. Under Christianity, and I mean both Catholicism and later Protestantism, there was anger at the Jews for our refusal to accept Jesus. Right? We, as we already saw, did not give up our faith. We did not become Christian of any type for 2,000 years. That's annoying to the Christians. It was also, however, more importantly, necessary to justify the new faith, Christianity, as being a replacement for the old. For Christianity to be meaningful and to be powerful within the world of ideas, Judaism cannot be effective, because otherwise you have two options for reaching God: be a Jew or be a Christian. And Christianity was not about putting up with another option. They want one option, one path, one religion, and that is going to be Christianity. So they had to explain why Judaism, which gave birth to their religion, that is to say, our books and our ideas were used as the beginning seed from which Christianity was then created out of. They had to explain that it was no longer valid, that Judaism had become superseded, so-called supersessionist theology. Jews then became the focus also of blame for the crucifixion, when missionaries were seeking favor with the Roman Empire. You go to Rome, it doesn't really do you much if you start off by saying, by the way, you guys killed our God. But if you say those Jews, whom you remember the Romans didn't like so much anyway, they killed our God, that gives them a nice common ground for the marketing. Now the Roman is reading the pamphlet. When Islam comes along, we see a similar pattern. In the very early days, Islam was quite welcoming to the idea of friendship with Jews. However, as time went on and it became clear that Jews were not going to give up our faith and were not going to embrace Islam nor recognize Muhammad as a prophet, that soured the relationship. Neither Christianity nor Islam is willing to tolerate any group that is not willing to fall in line and proclaim those faiths as being true and being perfect. That has made relationships difficult, to say the least. In the words of St. Augustine, however, that difficulty was on purpose. The church admits and avows the Jewish people to be cursed, because after killing Christ, they continue to till the ground of an earthly circumcision, an earthly Sabbath, an earthly Passover. So he is talking about, first again, repeating the idea that we were responsible for the death of Jesus, when in fact it was the Romans who murdered him, but that fact that we did so and that we continue to reject what they believe Jesus represents means that we are meant to be cursed, that we are supposed to suffer. He goes on to say, while the hidden strength or virtue making known Christ, the Jewish people, like Cain, continue tilling the ground and in carnal observance of the law, which does not yield to them its strength, because they do not perceive in it the grace of Christ. So he's saying, we continue to follow our rules. We continue to follow our laws. Physically, we actually do keep the commandments that God gave us in the Torah. The first 5 books that they also admit were given by God, but which they believe have been replaced by their Bible, what they call the New Testament, the Christian Bible, and that specifically through the coming of Jesus, the laws are no longer important to be kept in their physical form, but are meant to be kept only in a spiritual form, with many different ideas of why that is. It's not the time to go into Christian theology, but it means that our continued observance of the laws as really what God meant is considered to be offensive to them, because just by being Jewish, we are proclaiming that Jesus wasn't actually necessary. And that, like I said, is a problem. Judaism, since Christ, he continues, is a corruption. Indeed, Judas, the betrayer of Jesus in their Bible, is the image of the Jewish people. How convenient that they found somebody among the disciples of whom all were Jewish, that one should be the special Jew, that was the bad one. Their understanding of Scripture is carnal, meaning we actually take the Bible seriously rather than say it's all a metaphor for spirituality. They bear the guilt for the death of the Savior. We killed Jesus, they think, for through their fathers they have killed Christ. He has to tie that in because otherwise someone might have pointed out to him that even if some Jew had been responsible for the killing of Jesus, how can you blame all Jews for thousands of years for the killing of Jesus? But he does think that we bear the sin of our ancestors in that, and will continue to do so for all time. Now, Christianity and Islam both offer a convenient escape from all of this. All we have to do is give up our Judaism. We can convert to Christianity, we can convert to Islam, and then they won't hate us, because now we will be one of them, and we will have seen the light, and everything will be fine. And so too, as we saw in the cultural form of anti-Semitism, many of them did believe that if a Jew gave up their Jewishness, even if they kept their religion in some very truncated private form, that they would also welcome them as a friend within their community. We are going to see when we reach racial anti-Semitism that racial anti-Semitism does not have the same feeling. And in case you think that theological anti-Semitism is done, I should point out that the Catholic Church has rejected their theological anti-Semitism of the past. Both in the middle of the 20th century and late in the 20th century, they issued proclamations saying that Jews are not to be held responsible for the death of Jesus, and that Jews are not supposed to be targeted specifically for conversion to Christianity, and that we might even have a path to some form of salvation in our way. They are a little bit vague on how that works, calling it a mystery. So there has been progress, and there's also not been progress, as we see from this statement in 2010 by the Synod of Bishops. We Christians cannot speak of the promised land, meaning the land of Israel, as an exclusive right for a privileged Jewish people. This promise was nullified by Christ. In the kingdom of God, there is no longer a chosen people. So many Christians believe that our special relationship with God that is found through the Torah and found also with the land of Israel has been canceled, because after Jesus, it no longer counts. And after Jesus, there's no longer anybody that has any special relationship with God. Well, except for Christians, of course, but that's not their point. Their point is to deny us any claim or any validity to our feeling of connectedness to the land of Israel. So this theological anti-Semitism has definitely decreased over the 20th and 21st century, but unfortunately it still exists. And you will still hear Christ killer as one of the more common slurs by those that are peddling this form of anti-Semitism. Questions or comments on the theological varieties? There is one specifically painful and very persistent example of theological anti-Semitism that has actually left the theological realm and become both cultural and racial, and that is what we call the blood libel. This is the lie that Jews will use the blood of non-Jews, often specifically they believe children, for some of our religious purposes. Right? This is, of course, not happening ever at all. It is absolutely against Jewish law. It is absolutely against Jewish practice. It is simply insane. However, we can see that this has been going on for a long time. We can see Democritus from the 460 to 370 BCE wrote, "Every 7 years, the Jews captured a stranger, brought him to the temple in Jerusalem, and sacrificed him, cutting his flesh into bits." The idea of human sacrifice was considered abhorrent by many people at that time. And so this was sort of a generic way of saying that we were engaged in a bad thing. However, we also see that during the time of the Maccabee Wars, that we sacrificed captives according to Appian, who was another early anti-Semite. But where this really got going was during the time of in England in the 12th century. In 1144 CE, the Jewish community of Norwich was accused of ritually murdering the boy William of Norwich, who has since become sainted because we supposedly slaughtered him for his faith. Thomas Monmouth claimed that an international group of Jews had to kill a child in order to return us to Israel. This is one of the earlier forms of the myth that there is some secret, shadowy Jewish organization that is in control of the world, that we are arranging things and we cross borders in a way that no one else does, and that we are secretly plotting this, that, or the other. As you, of course, know, you cannot get Jews to agree on something in the same room. The idea of there being a secret Jewish organization that is somehow pulling the strings across the world is simply laughable, or it would be laughable if it had not led to so much bloodshed and death. This idea has persisted all the way up until the present day. And you will find that some people will claim that Israelis are murdering Palestinians to harvest their organs, which is basically just a rehashing of this particular form of blood libel. An interesting theological wrinkle, some of the Christian scholars of the Middle Ages believed that we were supposedly doing this because without the blood of Jesus to atone for us, we needed the blood of a Christian. The irony, of course, being that especially during the Middle Ages, the idea of the transubstantiation, the transformation of their communion wine into blood, meant that they actually did believe in blood consumption, even though we obviously did not. So there might have been a little bit of projection going on there. And unfortunately, this has persisted, and this has persisted and flared up very often around the holiday of Passover, of Pesach, with the belief being that that was a time when we would be most likely to be engaging in these practices. As I have said before, during, and again now, none of this is true. None of this ever has been true. None of this will be true. This is simply a pernicious lie that has not gone away. But anti-Semitism continues to come up with new varieties. So let's talk about racial anti-Semitism. With the 1800s, there was a rise in modern biology, and especially with Darwinism, there was an idea to want to categorize people, not just plants and animals. And by categorize, they mean divide them into subtypes, subgenres, that could then be compared and contrasted. This was used racially against everybody, since the primary people who were involved in this in the beginning were white Europeans. And they would categorize all of the races, of course, as inferior to their own. Not exactly objective science, to say the least. But they did also create the idea of there being a Jewish race. And this became a very convenient excuse for why they hated the Jews. After all, if we were just the same as them, but happening to have different culture or happening to have a different religion, well, that was something that Europe was becoming uncomfortable with. Europe had fought wars to try and settle the idea of Protestantism versus Catholicism, and they had vaguely been coming to the idea that they would tolerate each other, even if they believed and practiced differently, different forms of Christianity. They had fought wars over the different cultural aspects of Europe, and were vaguely coming to the idea that a good German was the same as a good Frenchman was the same as a good Englishman. They would still fight many more wars over that, but they were at least beginning to respect one another culturally. But Jews, they did not want to admit to the club. So by creating us a new niche of race, it provided a convenient excuse for why we could continue to be excluded, discriminated against, and hated, because after all, we were not like them. Now, unlike the earlier forms of cultural and theological anti-Semitism, a Jew has no hope of escaping these charges. We cannot convert out of our race. You cannot renounce your race the same way that you could renounce your peoplehood. You cannot change the way they categorized us as race. As we'll see later on, but I just want to give a quick heads up before we dive into this in more detail. There is no such thing as a Jewish race. Not in our concept, not in a biological concept, not in the mind of anyone except those who are anti-Semites. So just hold that in the back of your mind, and we'll loop back after we see some painful examples of how people thought about this. Oh, where's my mouse? There we go. And by people, I mean, of course, the great person who popularized this. Well, I shouldn't say popularized this. Racial anti-Semitism was common from the 1800s on, but Adolf Hitler took it to a new level and used it as a form of inspiration rather than merely a side form of hate. So Goebbels and Chamberlain were inspired by our concept, meaning Hitler's and like-minded Nazis, of a new order, or if you prefer, an ideological glimpse into history in accordance with the basic principle of blood. So he's saying after his meeting with these other leaders, he got them to understand and see that all of history was really a fight about blood, and that once you had the blood right, the world would come into a new focus. We do not judge by merely artistic or military standards, or even by purely scientific ones. So this is one of the things that he adds that becomes so damaging during his reign, that it's not just that the Jews are militarily weak, or that the Jews are artistically incapable, or that we are scientifically inferior, that there is a spiritual energy in the blood. We judge by the spiritual energy which a people is capable of putting forth. And again, he's talking about peoplehood here as a blood, as a genetic type. which will enable it in 10 years to recapture what it has lost in 1,000 years of warfare. So he is saying that the blood of the Germans gives it a potential that is unrivaled by any other blood, and they will be able to recapture what they have lost. Remember, he is talking after World War I, where Germany was devastated, and they will create something amazing. I intend to set up a 1,000-year Reich, and anyone who supports me in battle is a fellow fighter for a unique, spiritual, I would almost say divine creation. So he is taking this not just as being a pure biological separation, but believes there is something inherent in the blood, in the race of Jews, that is pernicious and a problem. And of course, the obverse, the opposite, there is something among the German blood that is supreme. So what is it about us that makes him so angry? The Jews have always been a people with definite racial characteristics and never a religion. You might be surprised. Everyone else has recognized that we are a religion, whatever else they say about us politically. What is he talking about here? Only in order to get ahead, he early sought for a means which could distract unpleasant attention from his person. And what would have been more expedient and at the same time more innocent than the embezzled concept of a religious community? So he sees us as being this rodent-like race of creatures that wanted to gain advantage over the world. And so we invented religion as our shield, as our cover story, to hide the fact that we are really a different creature. For here, too, everything is borrowed or rather stolen. Due to his own original special nature, the Jew cannot possess a religious institution, if for no other reason because he lacks idealism in any form, and hence belief in a hereafter is absolutely foreign to him. When we eventually do talk about the afterlife, you'll see that Judaism has been talking about the afterlife quite a lot, but that doesn't really matter to the Nazis. For the Nazis, anything that we showed that might be considered noble, we must have stolen. It's a very simple argument, method of argumentation. Anything that looks positive must be borrowed. Anything that's negative must be what's true. It means you can always win. And a religion in the Aryan sense cannot be imagined which lacks the conviction of survival after death in some form. He goes on to say, it is true, we Germans are barbarians. That is an honored title to us. I free humanity from the shackles of the soul, from the degrading suffering caused by the false vision called conscience and ethics. And yes, you are reading that right. He is saying that having a conscience or following a set of ethics is a shackle on the human soul, that is the problem for the world, that the world is crippled because of us, as you'll see, creating this concept of a conscience. The Jews have inflicted two wounds on mankind, circumcision on its body and conscience on its soul. And yes, circumcision, like the eating of pork, is another thing that commonly comes up in anti-Semitic attacks. So he is saying that we invented conscience, that was something novel that we created. They are Jewish inventions. The war for the domination of the world is waged only between these two camps alone, the Germans and the Jews. Everything else is but deception. He believed, and unfortunately many still do, that there are those who believe that people have a conscience and should follow ethics, and therefore there are limits to our behavior. And there are those, in his mind, he's calling them the Germans. Please, I do not believe actual Germans are like this, but certainly the Nazis are, that they know that the idea of a conscience and ethics limits the free will of the human spirit to rise as far as it can on the bodies of those it conquers. This is the whole concept of the Übermensch, of the Superman that the Nazis idolized, that without a conscience, without an ethics, the powerful humans can rise higher. Now, they always consider themselves to be the powerful ones, so therefore, of course, they don't want limits. Judaism, of course, teaches that ethics and conscience are there as gifts for everyone, and that anyone who thinks they're going to ride high without these limits has never seen what anarchy and chaos truly bring. In case you are wondering whether or not these are still problems, I thought I would just bring you some unfortunate pictures from recent history. And by recent, I mean both these photos have been taken within the last month. So on the left-hand side, you can see a gentleman wearing a shirt saying Camp Auschwitz with the English translation from the sign that was put over the death camp in Germany where so many were murdered. Work brings freedom. And this is, of course, somebody who is trying to say that what happened in Nazi Germany was a benefit. Similarly, on the right-hand side, you can see somebody wearing a shirt with the letters 6MWE over an eagle and the symbol of Italian fascism. The bundle of sticks is the basic root word from fascism. And the 6MWE is shorthand for 6 million wasn't enough. 6 million referring to the 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. This is somebody who believes that there should be more murder of more Jews. And both of these are ascribing to that racial idea of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is an ongoing problem of this type. And in fact, this is the form of anti-Semitism that is accelerating in recent years. But before I show you that issue of how this is accelerating, I just want to lay to rest, hopefully once and for all, that there is no such thing as a Jewish race. The genetic idea of race is very difficult by itself, since there are multiple genes responsible for a spectrum of features. Meaning that if you get a DNA test and it tells you that you belong to this race or that race, what it is actually doing is not saying it found your race gene. It is saying your genes seem to follow a pattern that is statistically similar to people who come from other parts of the world that have a similar statistical pattern. It doesn't mean that you will be identical to them. It doesn't mean that you necessarily even look like them. It just means that there are certain patterns which resemble other patterns. Among Jews, there are a few types that can show up occasionally, but as you hopefully all know, we do not believe in a genetic Judaism. A Jew does not believe that you are a Jew by virtue of your genes. You are a Jew if your family has the history and the legacy of being Jewish, or if you have converted to Judaism. And when you convert, your genes don't change. And when you convert, you can come from any race, you can come from any color, shade, hue, body type, whatever you want, and you can come from any country, from anywhere on the planet. And indeed, I have met Jews that represent as wide and diverse a cross-section of the global population as you could hope for. And all of them are equally Jewish. So there is no racial Judaism. However, this does not stop this from being a consistent problem. Part of the reason for that is because anti-Semitism remains wonderfully flexible. It is adaptable. Anti-Semitism has never needed to have facts on its side. From the 1850s forward to the present, people in the West the people who were communists were fighting against capitalism. And of course, therefore their enemies, the Jews, must be capitalists. In other communities, people were fighting against communism. Therefore, when they decided to hate the Jews in their communities, they labeled the Jews as communists. In the 1900s and onwards, as the racial typing got going, racists fought to keep their status. Therefore, Jews must be against whites. We must be a different race, and we must be helping other races to hurt the whites. That was the battle cry of the people in Charlottesville a number of years ago about Jews will not replace us. They were not talking about Jews outnumbering the whites. They were talking about Jews secretly in their mind, again, with this secret organization, bringing in non-whites to displace whites from America. 1960s onwards, Jews are fighting against civil rights abuses. Many people were fighting against civil rights abuses. And even though many Jews were also fighting, if they didn't like Jews, they would call Jews racists. 2007, we saw this flare up again for the first time since the Great Depression, as we had an economic collapse. Clearly, it must be the Jews' fault. And now, from around 2015 onwards, although it's been building in different forms, but only aggregating more recently, the QAnon and other forms of extreme conspiracy theories have rekindled all of the things that we've gone over. They're talking about secret organizations and satanic organizations and child-harming shadow groups that are drinking blood and all of those things. If that sounds familiar, you should not be surprised. Even though many of these organizations and conspiracies don't focus explicitly on Jews, they use language that is absolutely drawn almost 100% from traditional forms of anti-Semitism. And many of their adherents, as I showed you in the earlier slides, are more explicitly anti-Semitic as well. It fits very neatly together. Questions or comments before I talk a little bit more about the state of anti-Semitism in America today? All right. So let's talk about the number of anti-Semitic incidents. These are the incidents from 2008 to 2019. As you can see, there has been a general trend downward with fewer and fewer anti-Semitic acts up until the middle of the 2010s, and then it begins to come up again. And there was a sharp uptick in 2016, 17, 18, and 2019. Now, what makes this so surprising that this rising number of anti-Semitic attacks continues to rise is the fact that, I have my slides in the wrong order, that the number of Americans who are anti-Semitic has been going down. You can see here back in the 1964 survey, almost a third of Americans would agree with most anti-Semitic statements. By the time we get to 2019, we're down to only 11%. It's still not great that 10% of the people in this country are willfully and openly anti-Semitic, but this pattern is very different than the pattern of attacks. And what that is showing us is that the people who remain anti-Semitic are more and more prone to violence and more prone to putting it into action. For much of American history, people were anti-Semitic simply because they had been raised with anti-Semitism. But it did not motivate their actions, it did not guide their behavior. However, those who remain anti-Semitic are becoming more and more radicalized in their anti-Semitism and are more and more prone to acts of anti-Semitism against Jews. So despite the fewer people who are anti-Semitic, the remaining diehards are unfortunately making things very hard. In case you're wondering, Jews are indeed the largest single target of religion-based hate crimes in the United States. I mean, not just by a little, by a massive amount. Even in the years immediately following 9/11, when there was much more anti-Islamic and Muslim activity, Jews still faced more anti-Semitic crimes, hate crimes, than Muslims did. This continues to be the favorite form of religious discrimination in the United States. Questions before we dive into the question on Israel? In case you're wondering, well, isn't this all depressing? The answer is yes. For those of you that are Jewish, the fact that we have survived worse should come as some consolation. For those of you who are not yet Jewish and are considering a Jewish path, recognize that this is part of the bargain. We have done what we can to try and mitigate anti-Semitism of others, but by the virtue of becoming a Jew, you are likely to face anti-Semitism, or your community will face anti-Semitism in a way that you would not face were you not to be Jewish. If that is something that makes you think twice about becoming Jewish, that's fine. That is understandable. I would never encourage a person to put themselves in a position where they feel they would not be willing to suffer the potential antagonism and hate that others have. It is something that needs to be part of the calculation. And also to remember that anti-Semitism can sometimes come surprisingly, even from friends or family. I have met and worked with many conversion students who were quite surprised and quite devastated when they shared the news of their conversion with their family or friends, to find that some of them were absolutely furious and quite hateful in their response. So we are going to zip through anti-Israelism, because I see we've only got about 8 minutes left officially. So I'll do my best. You can always rewatch the video and slow down the speed on YouTube if you need to keep up with my talking. So first of all, a few ground rules. It is entirely possible to love Israel and criticize her government or the specific policies of the government. The same way that somebody in the United States can like one political party more than another, can like one policy more than another, so too a Jewish person or non-Jewish person can be perfectly fine with the state of Israel as a country, but be unhappy with any particular policies or governments or whatever there is. We are allowed to have different opinions. In fact, the vast majority of Israelis don't agree with their government in many measures. Only 30% of the Israelis voted for the current leader of the government, for Netanyahu. The fact that they voted for other people rather than the current government does not make them anti-Semitic. It does not make them traitors. They are allowed to have differences of opinion on how Israel as a country should be run. So if you want to know whether or not your criticism crosses the line, whether or not your criticism becomes anti-Semitism, you should ask yourself a few questions. Is the criticism only aimed at Israel or at all countries who do likewise? So for example, if you are saying that Israel is the worst human rights abuser in the world, something that people do sometimes claim, then you should be prepared to double check your math and find out whether indeed Israel actually abuses the rights of others more than other countries in the world. And you will find, of course, it does not. Not only is it not matched by other countries, but other countries around the world commit far worse atrocities on a daily basis and do not receive the same criticism or scrutiny. Does that mean that Israel never makes mistakes? Just like the United States, of course. Israel and its officials will make mistakes. That's what happens when you govern a country. But Israel is much more in line with the guidelines of human rights that most industrialized nations try to follow than many of the other countries which are still working on developing protections for rights. Is the critic able to acknowledge policies where Israel deserves praise? And if you say that Israel is terrible and everything it does is absolutely atrocious, then you are being blinded by some other feeling about Israel than just legitimate criticism of a particular policy or government. This comes up very often in many communities when someone will point out that Israel has a relatively positive stance on protecting the rights of different sexual affiliations, and people will claim that Israel is not allowed to be given praise for that, that is pinkwashing all of their other atrocities and crimes. Whether or not you want to actually say that there are other crimes, you should be able to at least admit that when it comes to how they treat people of different sexual orientations, Israel is ahead of certainly of all of her neighbors and ahead of many other countries as well. Is there an alternative policy suggested? If somebody is criticizing Israel for its treatment of the Palestinians, that is perfectly fine. A person can have a different opinion about how the situation with the Palestinians should be resolved, but they need to actually say how it should be resolved, not merely claim that Israel is evil. Put forward a plan, put forward a proposal, tell me exactly what you think should be done differently, and then we can discuss whether that would be effective or not, whether that would be legitimate in the eyes of Israel or not, or indeed in the eyes of the world. And are all attacks against Israel justified no matter how indiscriminate? If somebody is firing bombs into a kindergarten, if you say, well, that's what Israel deserves, you're anti-Semitic. Sorry to break it to you, but there is no justification for an indiscriminate or indeed a deliberate attack against children if you are actually trying to be fair in your understanding of a situation. For example, in 2019, Israel was hosting the Eurovision contest, which is a classic case. And many have argued that Israel should not host or that countries should not participate. Yet Eurovision was held in Azerbaijan without protest in the same year. That is to say, that the prior year. The European Commission condemned, in the same year that the European Commission condemned their human rights. So people should have been aware that Azerbaijan has indeed a worse track record on human rights, yet there were no protests, there were no complaints, there were no flags waved, there were no issues, because people simply viewed it differently than they view Israel. And it had nothing to do with the objective situations on the ground, but entirely to do with people's opinions about the Jewishness of the country. There are different ways to respond to different types of anti-Semitism. I'm going to just leave these up for a few seconds each because I want to get to a more broader summation. And like I said, you can always go back on YouTube and hit pause and be able to review some of the ways to respond to the anti-Israelism that can sometimes turn into anti-Semitism. Not all people who are not all people who raise objections to Israel or Israel's policies are anti-Semitic, and sometimes clarifying the issues and helping them understand the facts will get them to understand what can be done instead. So not everyone should be treated as an unrepentant and unredeemable enemy. I also want to talk about latent anti-Semitism. Many commentators, preachers, politicians, and regular people continue to hold to old stereotypes about Jews that are based on negative ideas. When Jews are all thought of to be cunning business people or lawyers, that's anti-Semitism, even if the person meant it as a compliment. It perpetuates the latent idea that we are focused on money and that we are scheming to acquire more. When people talk about Jewish racial features, big noses, swarthy skins, small height, stature, they're not engaging in anthropology. They're not studying the Jewish form. Right? They are perpetuating stereotypes that were picked precisely by the racist scientists of Europe because those were the opposite of what Europeans thought were attractive or noble. And of course, even before the modern increasing diversity of Judaism, you have never been able to point to Jews from all around the world and recognize them all as Jews by their height, by their nose, by their skin, or by any other feature. And when people wonder about our loyalty to America because we are somehow less native or attached to this nation because of our Jewishness, that is anti-Semitism. Anytime someone talks about dual loyalty, anytime somebody says that our country is Israel rather than the United States of America, that is anti-Semitic, even if they didn't mean it. They are continuing to cause more anti-Semitic stereotyping. So responses are hard. I'm going to leave up this wonderful research from Diana Muir, which points out that indeed the criticism of Israel is linked to anti-Semitism against Jews. It is not something that is purely political and only aimed at the state of Israel. And we know that many who protest Israel will do so by attacking Jews in other countries. But this is more research. But I do want to read, as we finish up, this incredible insight by Jean-Paul Sartre about anti-Semitism and the Jew, written in 1945. And it is about how you talk to people that are consumed with hate, how you talk to those people, and sometimes how it is a problem. The anti-Semite has chosen hate because hate is a faith. Right? It is not because of reasonable deduction that they have decided to hate. At the outset, he has chosen to devalue words and reasons. He is not coming to this with logic, and therefore you shouldn't be surprised that he doesn't care about the accuracy or the truthfulness of the words. How futile and frivolous discussions about the rights of the Jew appear to him. If, out of courtesy, he consents for a moment to defend his point of view, he tries simply to project his intuitive certainty onto the plane of discourse. I hate Jews because they make servants insubordinate, right? We make poor people uppity. Because a Jewish furrier robbed me, right? We cheated somebody at business, et cetera, et cetera. They know that their remarks are frivolous, right? They know they're being stupid. They know that it makes no sense. They know that it is open to challenge. But they are amusing themselves, for it is their adversary who is obliged to use words responsibly, since he believes in words. They can say the most outrageous, pointless, stupid, illogical things, but when somebody is trying to attack them, trying to defend Jews or defend against their hate, they are not able to just say outrageous, stupid, illogical things. Instead, we are handcuffed by having to actually use language correctly, by not being outrageous. They like to play with discourse, for by giving ridiculous reasons, they discredit the seriousness of their interlocutors. By being outrageous, it makes the whole conversation seem a joke. And indeed, people will often take their hate as though it were almost comical and not recognize the incredible danger that is built into the hate that they are joking about. It's one of the reasons why whenever someone says, I meant it as a joke, or I was just being sarcastic, or it was just hyperbole, that absolutely drives me bananas, which is, of course, their point. Because once you go crazy, you're no longer able to deal with the actual issue, and now you're responding to the spectacle rather than the main point. They delight in acting in bad faith, since they speak not to persuade by sound argument, but to intimidate and to disconcert. They want people to be upset. They want people to object. They want people to be afraid. They want people to think that they'll be the next target. If you press them too closely, they will abruptly fall silent, indicating that the time for argument is past. And the number of anti-Semites who have been on conversations and interviews who have simply said, I think we're done. You're not going to let me speak, and cut it off, is absolutely legion. It is not that they are afraid of being convinced. They're not worried that somehow you're going to present a logic that they're going to say, you know what, you're right. That is not going to happen. They fear only to appear ridiculous or to prejudice by their embarrassment their hope of winning over some third person to their side. They are on the stage in order to get new people to join them from among the many people who are not sure about the Jew, who are not sure about those that these people hate. And they want to make sure that they don't look too ridiculous. Ridiculous enough that they cannot be pinned down completely and that they make the conversation into enough of a joke that no one will take their hate too seriously, for no one will want to join initially if they believe it to be too hateful, but they can't make themselves into a laughingstock because no one would want to join them in their shame. This is playing out over and over and over again in our current society, especially in many online communities. This is exactly the operating manual. On Stormfront, which is one of the online hate group forums, they in fact go through this almost verbatim, although they don't give Sartre credit for it, as how they deal with people in the rest of the world. Make it a joke, exaggerate, use hyperbole, make sure that people are not able to pin you down, change the topic, make fun, and walk away if it looks like things are getting embarrassing. This is how those that hate operate. And we must be aware of it, because as I showed you, hate is continuing to be more active, even as the number of those that hate continues to decline. We have to be there to be sure that the numbers continue to go down and that those who act with hate are prosecuted and held accountable at all times, at all levels. Sorry again for going a bit long today, and that wasn't even everything we could have talked about. Please go back and review the video when you get a chance to look at some of the other information we had to skip. It is, I think, worth your time. Are there any final questions on this unfortunate topic for today?
Nope.
No, thank you, Rabbi.
All right.
Thank you.
Remember, the world is getting better. Those numbers show that there might be more incidents, but there are more better people than before. And that is what we have to focus on to make sure that this eventually just becomes something in the history books. Take care, everyone.